Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Menachot, Daf Zayin. Today's stuff is sponsored by Marsha Baum in loving memory of Helena K. Baum, Chana Chaya Altabat Chana V'Yakuti El Yehuda. 10 years have passed since she left us, and not a day goes by that she is not thought of and mentioned with awe. A woman with a deep love of family, Am Yisrael, and Yehudut. Zichra V'Liva. Okay, we're going to get started with our the review of what we did in yesterday's daf. So we started with this idea about we started with Beteira, who said you can actually you can fix a messed up kometz, where he really said it only about the left hand, if you did it with the left hand. But Rav said, oh no, it really relates to all disqualifications, to which the Gemara said, what's Rav adding? Isn't it obvious, Beteira? And if you didn't think it was obvious, well, we proved that the other Tanaim said it as well. And then we ended with suggesting that we had two opposite suggestions about what Rav held, whether he held like these other rabbis or didn't hold like these other rabbis. These rabbis being Rabbi Yosi ben Yasiyan and Rabbi Yehuda the baker. So, what did these two rabbis say? And again, whether Rav disagreed or agreed, that's not our main point today. But they both said that when Beteira permits to put it back in the batch, these two rabbis, he meant if you did the kometz. Okay, let's just talk for a minute before we even go to this answer about the process. It's very important to understand the process. Okay, for those going to visit the bakery of the Beit HaMikdash tomorrow with us, you'll see it really what goes on. But if not, you're going to listen and we're going to explain it right now, which is, first the person takes this dough that they have, they bring it, so to speak, from their house, according to the sources, they bring the dough, they bring it to the temple, and it's placed in a sanctified vessel. That's sanctified vessel number one. Okay, today we're going to talk about these multiple sanctified vessels that are needed for this process. Okay, just want to point out, when it comes to a sacrifice, what we learned until now, they slaughter the animal and then they put the blood in a sanctified vessel. There's only one sanctified vessel. In the mincha, there's two. The whole dough goes in the sanctified vessel. Then the Kohen takes the kometz out from there, right? He takes a handful out, which using his 3 middle fingers. Then he takes that handful and places that in a sanctified vessel. Brings that to the altar and then burns that on the altar. So from the point of the Kohen taking the kometz, it's very parallel to the sacrifice. Slaughtering, right? Separating something out, collecting it in a sanctified vessel, walking it to the altar, putting it on the altar, burning it, or in the case of the animal, it depends what, the blood on the altar really. And here there's no blood, it's the kometz. Gets burned. So now what they're saying is, if he just did the kometz, we can put it back. But once he did that action of putting it in that sanctified vessel, it's irreversible. That's basically what these two rabbis said. Yosi ben Yasiyan and Rabbi Yochanan. Now, Rav either agreed with them or disagreed with them about what Ben Beteira held, right? They were talking about within Ben Beteira's opinion, and he either said, no, even if you put it in that vessel, or maybe he agrees with them completely. But the question is really going to be on them now. So the Gemara starts asking, My kasavre hane tonight, 4 lines from the bottom. What exactly are they holding? Right, from the bottom of Vav Amud. If they think that the kometz of a person who's disqualified or whatever way it was disqualified is actually a ritual act, it's valid ritual act, it's just messed up, well, it shouldn't need putting in the kli to say this is irreversible. Okay, it's irreversible because you did navoda and you did it wrong, so you can't put it back. And then it shouldn't matter if it went in the kli or didn't go in the kli. If we don't view this as any significant action, so you did nothing because you did it wrong, so it's not even a ritual. Well, so what if you put it in the kli? That shouldn't mess it up anymore. In other words, it already isn't even a ritual. So if it's not a ritual, then putting it in a sanctified vessel is like taking a button and sticking it in a sanctified vessel. Nothing happens when you do that. So therefore, there should be no problem. So either which way, it makes no sense to differentiate between whether you took the kometz and didn't yet put it in the vessel or did put it in the vessel, okay? Shouldn't make a difference. To which, after Rav Nachman asked this question, Rav Nachman, okay, I forgot to read it as Matkefla Rav Nachman. This is an attack of Rav Nachman on this. Rav Nachman then answers himself. Hadar Amar Rav Nachman la'olam avodihi. These two rabbis, remember, Rav Nachman's question, these two rabbis, they're not alive anymore, they're Tanaim, he's 3rd generation Amoraim. So he asks this question, then he answers his own question, and he says, they must be holding that it's avoda, but what? And this is going to lead us to a whole other big question. V'lo gamra avodata ada avile matan kli. Well, you did half an avoda. In other words, it is a ritual, the kometz, even when it's disqualified. But the ritual is not completed till it's put in a sanctified vessel. So once it's put in the sanctified vessel, the ritual is complete and disqualified, and therefore irreversible. But if you haven't yet put in the kli, you've only done part of the ritual, you haven't finished it, so therefore it can be redone. That's his approach, which sounds reasonable. But the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute. You forgot one important point, which is what? What do you do with it when it's reversible? You put it back into where? Into the original dough. Where's the original dough? In a sanctified vessel. So if putting it in a sanctified vessel finishes the act and says, oh, this is a complete act now, and now it's completely disqualified because you did it wrong, then even if you don't put it in that second sanctified vessel, what are you doing? You're returning it to the original. When it goes back to its original vessel, it should be sanctified and disqualified. Okay? So basically, if you really think that it's, and as again, this was just to answer his question. He had no other way to understand it. He said it must be just missing putting it in the sanctified vessel. But now we have a big problem because putting it in the original sanctified vessel now should sanctify it. We're going to have two answers to this question. I'm telling you the structure because we're going to have, the way it's going to work, just because we're going to get a little sidetracked with some questions on each approach, but we're going to have two answers, and then we're going to have a third possibility that Rabbi Uriah basically says, they could have answered a much simpler answer. The fact that they didn't answer us is going to lead us to believe something, okay, and that's going to take us off in another sugya. So that's our structure for right now. I'm a Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan answers the first answer. He says, Zot Omeret. Now, it's an interesting way to answer it. From here, you can conclude, okay, now it's saying, and that would resolve our problem, Klei sharet emekachin elamidat. When you sanctify something, when you put something in a sanctified vessel and it sanctifies it, like putting this kometz in the second vessel, that's not the same as putting it in the first vessel to return it for, to redo it, because then it won't be sanctified. Because what? To complete the process, because sanctification in a sanctified vessel doesn't work by just throwing something in a sanctified vessel. Just like we said before, if it's a button that you throw in, it's not going to mean anything. It's not like magic happens, it goes into the vessel. What does it need? Our all-important ingredient we've been learning out throughout Masechet Zvachim and now the beginning of Menachot, it needs intentionality. You need to put it in that vessel with the intent, I want to sanctify it. So if you did the kometz and you were, let's say, a non-Kohen, and you put it in that sanctified vessel with the intent to, the second one, to sanctify it, well, you did, and it was completely disqualified, and now it's too late. It's a point of no return. You can't fix it anymore. But when you return it to the original, you're not trying to sanctify. First of all, it was already sanctified originally, and all you want to do is put it back in that original vessel and redo everything you did. So it doesn't become sanctified, and that's why it doesn't complete the process, the messed up process, and that's why it's reversible. So, okay, that's what Rabbi Yochanan says. The problem is, we're going to say, wait a minute. Are you trying to say that hamidat mekachin, if that non-Kohen, or again, any of those cases where it was disqualified, went ahead, put it in the second vessel, what you're basically saying is, it had intentionality, they wanted to make it sanctified, even though it's disqualified, it becomes sanctified, right? I don't know if you caught that before, but it's a little weird to be sanctifying something that's disqualified. And basically what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is, again, he's explaining these two rabbis, these two Tanaim, who basically say if you put in the second vessel, it's completely disqualified. Why? Because we're assuming, because you add intentionality to sanctify it. You sanctify it, what's the problem? It's disqualified, so it's no good. And then it's irreversible, cannot be redone. As opposed to if you put in the first vessel where you didn't intend anything here of sanctifying it, so it never becomes sanctified, the process is never finished, it can just be redone. But that means that midat, with your intent, you can actually sanctify something that's completely disqualified in a sanctified vessel, right? And that's Rabbi Yochanan. Now, Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. Now, we're going to go back to a previous conversation Reish Lakish had with Rabbi Yochanan. It seems clear Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold this way. Kli sharet. So Reish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan, Kli sharet ma'oshi kadshu psulin lechatchila likarev. He was asked directly about this question. If you put sanctified items, now it's not exactly directly because you're going to see it's a little bit different. And in the end, that's going to be the answer. It's completely different. But right now, they think it's similar. If I put something disqualified into a klei sharet, will it make it if it's ma'oshi kadshu? Does the sanctified vessel sanctify it to the extent that I could take psulim, but lechatchila likarev, and I could put them on the altar? This sounds very similar to things that went on the altar, even if they were messed up, they can stay on the altar. So maybe things that are disqualified that end up in a sanctified vessel, maybe I can put them on the altar. And what did Rabbi Yochanan say? Amar le ema kadshin. So what do you see here? Even though the person intentionally put an item that was disqualified in the sanctified vessel, it's not actually sanctified. Meaning, why is it not sanctified? Well, I can't sacrifice it, so it must be not sanctified. So Amar le, so now this isn't really Amar le, because that was a conversation Reish Lakish had with Rabbi Yochanan, and now we're bringing this into our conversation. Some people take out the words Amar le, because it's not anymore Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, it's the Gemara trying to resolve Rabbi Yochanan with this statement he made earlier, but I thought maybe you could read it as Amar le, he said to him, meaning we're quoting what Rabbi Yochanan said. Pay attention to his words. What did he say? He said they're not sanctified for the purposes of putting it on the altar, but they're sanctified enough that we could call this disqualified. That what? What does it mean? That it would be irreversible. So there could be, it was an interesting idea, my intent to put something in a sanctified vessel, if it's completely disqualified, I can't sanctify that to say, oh, now it's fine and we can put it on the altar, but I sanctified enough to call it disqualified. And that, again, explains, according to Rabbi Yochanan, this position of these two Tanaim. If I put it, again, let's just review. According to the way he reads it now, it is an avoda to do kometz that's disqualified, but it's not a complete avoda. It's not completed, which if it gets completed, that means li pasel, to disqualify it and say this is irreversible. Then that would only happen if it actually went into the sanctified vessel with intent, the second sanctified vessel, to sanctify that kometz. But putting it back in the original vessel doesn't do that, because I'm not intending to sanctify it, and because of that, I haven't finished the process of sanctifying it, and therefore the kometz, while it is an avoda, it's only a partial avoda, and therefore it can be redone. Okay, that's how he explains it. But now we're going to have a second answer to that question, which isn't going to assume this whole thing, and that he's going to explain a different reason why putting it back in that original sanctified vessel is not a problem. And within this, we're going to have what we call an ukimta, which is, it's only a unique situation, which means Rav Nachman really does think like the question thought, which is putting it back in that original sanctified vessel will actually complete the process. Forget da'ad and intent and all that. Okay, it's really a problem. So how would it work? So Rav Nachman is going to give one answer, and we're going to have to modify it a little bit because it's not going to really make enough sense. Rav Amar Mamar, Kigon shechziro levisa gedusha. You put it back in a bowl that was heaping. The dough was coming up out of the bowl, and you put it at the top. And what's the issue there? Why is it not sanctified? Because a sanctified vessel only sanctifies what's within its walls, not the stuff that's up on top. Okay? So basically, now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is, if you put it back into the original vessel and it's heaping, then what happened originally when you took out the kometz? It must have been heaping too. And if you go to a heaping bowl and you take a handful out, where are you taking it from? The top, where it's heaping, which means that this makes no sense. How did he take the kometz in the first place? The Kohen, when he went to take the kometz, he took it from the top part, which is above the rim of the vessel, which is in sanctified. So that pot can't really be. So they're going to explain Rav Amram in some other way. You put it back in a completely flat, okay, it was level. That's the word I'm looking for. It was level with the top of, so the dough was completely level. That explains how you were able to take the kometz, and now you put it back. And when you put it back, since it's completely level, it's above the level of the vessel. And that's how you can put the kometz back without it becoming sanctified, because it's not in the walls of the vessel. But that's not going to work either, because let's think about it. Again, it had to be, let's say it was level, fine. You could say maybe it was level when you took the kometz out. But you take a bowl full of dough that's level, and then you take out a kometz from it. What's going to happen? There's going to be a hole, right? There's going to be a gap there where the kometz was. And it can't be it was level with a little bit sticking out to begin with, because then you'd have the same problem. So it must have been, yes, you could say it's level, but there must be a hole there. And then the obvious point is, when you kimahadir, when you return it to there, ligave demana kamahadir, right? Just think about what's going to happen. When it's full, right? It's full to the top. You took out the kometz, so there's a hole there. When you put it back in, you're basically going to stick it right back in that hole, in which case it's within the walls, in which case it gets sanctified, which is back to square one, our problem. So they say the following. No. When you do it, Okay, now this is, if you mess it up and you want to fix it, you have to do it in this way. What do? You put it back. Okay, so imagine this vessel, the height of the dough is level with the top. So you put it, but there's a hole in the middle. So you don't put it back in the hole. You put it back on the side of the wall there where now your kometz is sticking up. And it doesn't become sanctified right then. Then what happens? Manidle, then you shake the bowl a little bit, you move it around a little, v'nafal mimela, and it just sort of falls into place. And then everything's level, and then you can take the kometz out, the kometz out from the level, but you didn't make it level directly. And what do they say here? This is, you might remember from some other sugyo, because it's very memorable. It's like a monkey, put it back in. It's not like you did it because you didn't do it yourself, right? A monkey comes into play when we don't have intentionality, right? So it's like someone else did it, okay? Or a monkey did it. It's not considered important at all. Therefore, it doesn't become sanctified. So again, you don't need to sanctify this. This was sanctified to begin with. The problem is if it becomes sanctified in that vessel, then actually you're completing the process of the problematic kometz, and then you can't do it again. So you do it in such a way, again, we had to do an ukimta here, which is number one, we had to say it was completely level, but that's not such a crazy ukimta anymore, right? When we were saying it was heaping, it didn't make sense. But it's also telling you the way you have to return it, though, is only if you put it at the top, above the level of the rim, of the vessel, and then shake it a little, it'll go down inside, and it won't become sanctified in that manner. So we have either Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't become sanctified because you didn't have intent to sanctify it, or according to Rav Amram, who seems to think you really do need intent, but you don't really need intent, but you do need an action, but a direct action. Indirect action won't do it. Okay, so those are our two answers. Now, Rabbi Yirmiyah comes and says they could have had a third answer. It was a very easy answer. The fact that they didn't answer it must mean that this is not the case. Okay, so what does he say? Amalei, not that this is not the case. I should say that the halacha is not in this particular way we're going to see right now. So Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah goes to his rabbi, Rabbi Zera, and he says to him, V'lukma, why didn't they just say, Kigon shechziro l'kli munach hagabei karka? Why didn't they just say, put it back in the vessel while the vessel's on the ground? Why would that matter? Because maybe you need to return it. He's saying it must be you need to return it when the Kohen is holding it. You don't sanctify something in a sanctified vessel unless the Kohen is holding the vessel. So what does he say? Well, we don't know if that's the case or not. So what is he saying? If you could, right? So now he's saying, Ela shmamina komsim mikli sha'al gabei karka. He says from the fact that they didn't say, put it back in a vessel that's on the ground that the Kohen's not holding, and that will resolve it, because then it won't be sanctified. It must be you don't need that to sanctify it. It must be you can actually sanctify a vessel, an item in a sanctified vessel, even if the Kohen's not holding it. Now, where would they get this idea that the Kohen needs to be holding the vessel? And then the question could be, why does it not fit here? The place they would get it from would be from, if we go back to animals, what happens? There's shchita, there's kabbalah. Some Kohen is standing there collecting the blood in a vessel. We don't just let the blood drip down into a vessel. A Kohen needs to be holding it. So we're going to assume here, that's what Rabbi Zera seems to assume, wouldn't you think the same thing is true for the kometz? And therefore, if no one's holding it, that should be a great way to resolve the problem. As long as no one's holding it, well, if it's on the ground and you put it back while it's on your ground, you throw it in, that's not going to be sanctified because there's no Kohen holding it. Now, they don't say that. He claims it must be that you don't need that. It's not an essential part that someone be holding it. It's going to be sanctified even if no one's holding it. And that's what he derives from the fact that they don't answer that answer. Now we're going to go into a whole sugya about this. Do you need a Kohen to be holding it? Do you not need? Rabbi Yirmiyah seems to clearly say you don't need anyone to be holding it. Okay? So now that's what he says. But his rabbi, Rabbi Zera, answers him and says, what are you talking about? Amar lei, kanagata bebaya di bayalan. You're talking about it, you're assuming, making this assumption, but this is a question that was asked already, and we're going to see that Avimi answers that no, you need a Kohen, he says. Okay? So he's not just saying this is a question that was already asked, and the answer was not what you just said. So it's going to take us a little while to get to the answer and the whole thing. We get a little introduction, which gives us a little bit of history. To Rabbi Avimi, Tane Menachot Bei Rav Chisda. First of all, it's fun to see these rabbis sat in the Beit Midrash learning Masechet Menachot, like we're doing, maybe not in the Beit Midrash, but we're learning Masechet Menachot. He went to the Beit Midrash of Rav Chisda to learn Masechet Menachot. Now, something's a little strange about this, because Rav Chisda is third generation Amora. Avimi is first to second generation, and not only that, but Avimi, Be Rav Chisda Tani, the Gemara stops the story before we even get started. It says, what do you mean, Avimi didn't study in the Beit Midrash of Rav Chisda? Because we're going to see that not only was he older than him, which maybe he could be studying his Beit Midrash, but Avimi was the rabbi of Rav Chisda, or at least at some point taught him. Okay? Because Hama Rav Chisda, don't you remember Rav Chisda said, Kulfei Tave Bale Me Avimi. I got a lot of blows, okay, attacked. It's unfortunate, right? We don't really like to hear about beating of students, but right, whether he got physical ones or not, I don't know. But what he was saying is, I got hit a lot of times from Avimi, Allah da Hashmata, about this drasha. Okay, whether this drasha is connected or not to our topic, it definitely doesn't seem connected. Maybe someone could try to make a connection, but right now I'm just going to learn it. This is a situation where we have orphans whose father died, obviously, that's why they're orphans. They have property from their father and they have to sell it in order to pay off loans that the father had. Now, when you go to sell it, there's always a problem. People are going to see orphans are selling, they need the money, they're going to give a low price. So there's a rule that you have to announce about it for a certain period of time to allow for a proper market value to be received on this property. So how much time? And basically what we're hearing about this is that when Avimi taught Rav Chisda, either he physically hit him or he blew it over, onto his head many times until he got it straight, this halacha. Okay? So all this is coming to say, really, from in terms of the flow of the sugya, again, maybe there's some inner meaning there, but from the flow of the sugya, what they're trying to say is, Avimi was clearly superior or the rabbi of Rav Chisda. It doesn't make any sense Avimi was sitting in the Beit Midrash of Rav Chisda. So what's the halacha? Ba'ala hachriz ritzufin 30 yom, sheni v'chamishi 60 yom. If you're going to announce every single day, then you do it for 30 days every day of the week. If you do it only on Mondays and Thursdays, if anyone started the Megillah challenge, you'll know all about the Mondays and Thursdays when the shuk and the marketplace and people came. So if you do it only Mondays and Thursdays, you only have to do it for 60 days. Now, you don't have to do it, for the amount of days of every day for 30 days because you're doing it in the most popular days where more people are in town and more people will hear it. But 30 days is not enough. Then you have to do it for 60 days. Okay, meaning over a period of 2 months. Obviously, you don't do it 60 times. Okay, so how do we explain that Avimi was in Beit Midrash of Rav Chisda? Well, Avimi masechta it akra. What happened was he forgot Menachot. Okay, he learned it at some point. He didn't remember it anymore. If you feel good about the fact, feel better about the fact that you don't remember things. He didn't remember it. Now, whether he got old and lost his, his memory got more bad, we don't know. But for whatever reason, he forgot Masechet Menachot. So he went to Rav Chisda to learn it from him, to relearn the Masechet. So they say, if he was the superior, why didn't he just call Rav Chisda or send a messenger to Rav Chisda and say, come to me and teach it to me? Well, he wanted to do the amal, as we say. He wanted to make the effort. So he said, I'll go to his Beit Midrash. I'll make the effort to go there. The more I put into it, the more I'm going to get out of it. So I'll make the effort. Okay, that was the side point. Now, while he's in the Beit Midrash learning Masechet Menachot, Pagabe Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman meets him and he says to him, Rav Nachman asks him, Amalei, Ketzad Komtzim, how do you do Kmitza? Remember, he's the superior, right? He's the elder. Amarle points to a vessel on the ground and he says, Miklize, from this vessel. So Amarle, Rav Nachman says to him, right? So he says like this one. So he says, right? He says, you're going to take a kmitza from a vessel that's on the ground? And as he assumed when he pointed at it, he meant like this vessel, right? And in the way that it is, where it's sitting on the ground. So Amarle, Timagdabe Kohen. No, I meant a vessel like that, but a Kohen obviously is holding it. Okay, so what do you see here? Already we see Avimi disagrees with what Rabbi Yirmiyah said, and that's what Rabbi Zera said to him. What are you talking about? Rabbi Yirmiyah was asked, Avimi was asked this question, and he said, no, it needs to be held by a Kohen. So I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, now, okay, so just pay attention. He asked him, how do you do the kmitza? How do you take the kometz out of the bowl? What kind of bowl does it need to be in? A bowl like this. On the floor? No. The Kohen needs to be holding it for the first stage, okay? So, really the 3 stages. There's one stage where you put it in a vessel, the second stage where you take it from the vessel, the kmitza, the Kohen takes it out, and the third stage is when the Kohen puts the kometz into a new vessel. So he asks him about the stage 2. how do you take the kometz out of the bowl? The Kohen has to be holding it, he says. Ketzad mikadshim et menachot. So Rav Nachman says, how do you do the kiddush menachot, like in the first place? How do you put the whole dough into the vessel? He says, do you put it in a kli like this? Same conversation is going to happen now. What, you can put it in the dough into the bowl in the first place, right? Stage 1, while it's on the ground. He said, no, obviously I mean when a Kohen's holding it. So he requires it for stage 1, for stage 2, and obviously stage 3, right? Because stage 3 is when you put the kometz into the vessel. That's the most important part. That's the most similar to the slaughtering and all that, and the kabbalat hadam. So Amarle, so Rav Nachman's still not really very pleased with this whole thing. He says, Im Ken, right? It's funny because he was arguing with him before like that on the floor, and he says, no, of course Kohen holds it. So now he says, wait a minute. But then Im Ken utzrachta shlosha kohanim, so then you need 3 kohanim. One to hold it at stage 1, one to hold it at stage 2, one to hold it at stage 3. Amarle, v'teit shricha shlosha sar kitamid. So what? You need 3 kohanim. The tamid needs 13 kohanim. Okay, you need 3 kohanim, by the way, in addition to the one who's doing the kmitza. Now, you could have some doubling, and there's a whole big debate about why 3. Some people say it doesn't really mean 3. It just means you need more than 1, okay? Because you need the Kohen who does the kometz can't possibly be holding it. Why? Because you have to hold it in your right, and you have to take the kometz out in your right. You can't both be holding the vessel and taking it out with the right hand. So anyway, he basically says that doesn't make any sense. And then the guy says, of course it does. You can need a lot of kohanim just like that. But now he brings some difficulty on him. He says, look at this Mishnah. We're going to see it on Daf Yud. This is the rule. Kol kometz, the one who takes the kometz out, notein b'kli, puts it in the vessel, molich, walks it to the altar, and maktir, burns it. Those are the 4 actions that are very similar to shchita, kabbalah, holach, and zrika. And then it's going to be lechol davar shadar kol lechol, etc. This is all going to be the repeat of zvachim, but in menachot of the pigul and all that. Okay, chutz l'mkamo, chutz l'zmano, all that. Now, notice what it doesn't say there. Ilu magbiel lo katani. It never says, and the one holding the vessel never says that. So what do they say? Right? Notice here it says notein b'kli and not kabbalah b'kli. Right? It says the one who, the action is the putting it in the vessel. It doesn't talk about, right? In Kabbalah, it's someone holding a vessel, accepting it. In the kometz, it's putting it in the vessel. So it comes Avimi and he says, Tana Seder Avodot Nakav, Lo Seder Kohanim. That wasn't the topic of the Mishnah. What was the Mishnah talking about? The actions. It's not an action to stand there holding it. It's not one of the major actions. It might be necessary, right? You need to have a Kohen holding it. You can't have it on the ground. But it's counting the action when you do this action and you have a thought that's pigul, that I'm going to eat it in the wrong time or burn it in the wrong time. That is only those 4 actions. It doesn't mean there's a Kohen not holding it. It wasn't saying how many Kohanim do you need for this activity. It wasn't the topic of the Mishnah. So it didn't mention the guy holding it, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have to be that way. It might have to be that way. So he resolves the difficulty against him. So we have Rabbi Yochanan who tried to assume you don't need to be holding it at all. Otherwise they would have just answered, have it on the floor, and that resolves our problem. But comes Rabbi Beteira and says, look, Avimi said you need it, and you need it for all 3 actions. Now we're going to see Rav Sheshet, who basically seems to say the same thing Rabbi Yirmiyah says. And then we'll see a third opinion of Rava. So they asked Rav Sheshet this question. Can you take the kometz out of a vessel? Again, he's talking about one of the stages, right? The middle stage. Can you take the kometz out of a vessel that's on the ground? Amarle, puk chaze ma avdin legao. This is a very interesting thing. Go look at what they're doing inside the hechal. Now, they're living in a time where there's no Beit HaMikdash. You can't go in and look. But what he means is go look at a Mishnah, which talks about how they did the lechem hapanim, which was inside the sanctuary. And we're going to learn from there. Okay? Let's see. Arba'a kohanim nechnesim. So when they want to switch the showbreads, there were 12 showbreads. They were in rows of 6 and 6. And there were 2 bowls of frankincense there as well. And what they would do is, every week on Shabbat, they would switch. They would have kohanim carry out the breads and carry out the bowls of frankincense. They would burn the frankincense on the altar, and then that would permit the bread to be eaten. And at the same time that they would take them out, they would bring in the new ones and put the new bowls of frankincense. So they now list, notice they're talking in numbers. Arba'a kohanim, 4 kohanim go in. 2, shnayim biyadam shnei sterim. Each of them are holding. As one's holding one seder, one group of 6, the other one's holding another group of 6. Ushnayim biyadam shnei b'zichim, and each one's holding one of the bowls of frankincense. Arba'a makdimim lefnehem, and 4 actually come in before them, because in order to put the breads in, you're going to have to take everything off first. Shnayim litol shnei starim, shnayim litol shnei bezichim. Right, so 2 take off each 6 loaves, and the others each take off a bowl of frankincense. Now, what's missing here in this count of kohanim? Turning now to Amabet, ilu magbiat hashulchan lo katani. It doesn't say one's holding the table. Now, you might think vessel table, it seems a little different. But nobody picks up the table, right? You would think if the actions require holding the vessel while you're doing it, then the showbread would require this. So they say, the Gemara says, Lava Marhatim, didn't we just answer those? Tana Seder Avodot Nakat, that the Tana was just talking about the actions. Hachanami, you could say the same thing here. Seder Avodot Nakat, it was just talking about the main actions. It just didn't mention the lifting of it. But the Gemara says, Midami, this isn't the same as I already kind of mentioned. Hatam Lo Nachat L'Minyana De Kohanim. There it wasn't saying how many Kohanim did the actions. Here it was counting. How many kohanim, right? Like how many people say switch a light bulb, right? Famous joke. How many people did it take to switch the showbread? It's telling you basically. It didn't ask the question, but it basically seems to be addressing that. 2 to do this, 2 to do that, 2 to do that, 2 to do that. Doesn't mention any mention of anyone else. So it sounds like you could take the kometz, just like you took the frankincense and the bread from the table that wasn't being held up. Seems like you don't need to do it. So we have 2 completely opposite approaches, and now we're going to have the middle approach. And that's going to lead us to a totally different sugya, which is a repeat sugya of Zavachim, which is always nice. So Amarav, Pshitali konsim miklisha al gabei karka. Okay, so what's he going to do? If we have already one opinion, we have the opposite opinion, what's going to be the middle opinion? There's a difference between the 3 actions, okay? And that's why I've been setting them up so well. Putting the dough first into the vessel, taking the kometz out of the vessel, and putting it into the sanctified vessel, the kometz. So, pshitali konsim miklisha al gabei karka. Action 2, the middle one, you can definitely take the kometz out if it's on the ground. As we just learned from the removal of the bowls of frankincense. Mikachim, because also the kometz is very similar to the bezichim. Okay, it's like taking something and then burning it on the altar. Mikachim mincha b'klisha al gabei karka. Stage 1, you can also put all the dough in a bowl that's on the ground. Same thing with putting the bowls of frankincense out, right? They put them on the table, nobody's holding the table. So they take them off the table, that's like taking the kometz out. They put them on the table, that's like putting it down. But Rava asked, Kiddush kometz mai. But Rava wanted to know, what about sanctifying the kometz? When you take that kometz out and you put it in that bowl, now why is that different? Well, mi mincha yofinala. Do we learn it from mincha, learning it, let's say, from the lechem apanim? Oh, midam yofinala. Do we learn it from the blood? Because that, as we talked about, taking the kometz is like slaughtering the animal. And then, with the slaughtering of the animal, what do you do with the blood? You collect the blood in a sanctified vessel that the kohen's holding. So maybe the kometz has to be put in a sanctified vessel that the kohen's holding. Because that's the main action, right? The other things are prerequisites. You can't do it without it, but it's not the main actions. So Hadar Pashta Rava then answered his question, midam yalfinana. We learn it from the blood. And therefore he makes this differentiation. The first 2 actions can be done while it's on the ground. But that third action, which is basically the main central act, one of the main central actions, as we saw from that Mishnah we just quoted about, these are the actions where you have a pigal thought, it ruins it, then it has to be held by the Kohen. So that's our in-between position. So now we're going to ask a question on Rava. Umi amar Rava hachi, did he really say that? V'ha'itmar kometz shechilko b'shnei kelim. Now we're going to basically compare another action of this kometz and putting it in the vessel to the animals. And we're going to see Rava says it's different. We don't learn one from the other. Why? Well, a kometz, let's say you take the kometz, and instead of putting it in the vessel, first you split it in 2, and then put each half in a vessel. Now for the kometz, the whole kometz needs to be burnt. That's your whole shear. If you split it into 2 vessels, does it work or not? Rav Nachman Amari no kadosh. It doesn't work. Rava Amar kadosh. Rava says it works. So what if you put it in 2 vessels? It's fine. As long as in the end you burn the whole thing, it's fine. Vim ita, and if it's really true that we learn this from the blood of the animal, leilaf midam. Right? If the kometz is learned from there, we should learn from blood, because blood can't be put in 2 vessels. Now you might think we have all these sugars, and what if they collected the blood in 2 cups? But you might remember we learned this, and this is why we're going to go over it again. You have to have in each cup, like even if you collect it in 2 cups, but the cup has to have enough for a shear to be of blood to be sprinkled. Now here, you're taking the kometz, which the whole thing has to be. You can't split it in two vessels if you're going to learn it from the blood, because the blood, you have to have at least a shear enough in that one vessel when you collect it. You can't take a little bit of blood in one, a little bit of the blood in the other. It's not enough together and combine them after. You might remember where we learned this from. If not, we're going to review it. But right now they assume, okay, they're not talking about how you know it. They're just assuming we know it, that it can't be done with blood. So Rava should learn it from blood. If he learns that from blood, right, putting it in the vessel, then this other halacha, putting it in the vessel, should be learned from blood. You can't split into two vessels. To which they answer, very simply, Hadrabe Rava Mahi. He changed his mind about this one, okay? And he agreed in the end with Rav Nachman that you can't split into two vessels because he learns it from blood. Now we're going to go into the blood. Vidam minalan delo kadosh l'chatzim. How do you know that blood is not sanctified if you put it in again, the amount that you need for sprinkling is split up into two. The minimum amount, enough to go doing your sprinklings around the altar, can't be split into two vessels. Titani Rav Tachlifa bar Shaul. So this is a complete repeat sugya. Rav Tachlifa bar Shaul says, brings a braita. Kidesh, now we start off with paraduma. Okay, you take kidesh, pachot michdei azah, when you're preparing the paraduma waters. If you prepare in the vessel, also sanctified vessel, the water with the ashes, and it's not enough to do the sprinkling, you did it in two different vessels and then put them together, lo kidesh, it doesn't work. And then after they brought this braita, he asked the question, b'damai, what's the situation with sacrifice? Is it the same or not? What are the two reasons to say it would be the same or different? Well, they first start off why we think maybe you don't learn from paraduma, because hilchatahi. Okay, we're going to see in a minute where you might learn it. So either the reason for paraduma that you have to have enough in that one vessel is what we call a hilchata, which means it's a very ancient tradition. Okay, it doesn't say so in the Torah, but it's as if, it kind of passed down from Sinai, something in between Doraita to Rabbanan, and usually it means we don't even have a reason for it. So it's a unique halacha, which means mehilchata lo yafina. We don't learn from there to the blood. O dilma hata my time, or maybe we do have a reason. And then we can apply the same reason, because why? We'll see. Dichtiv, what does it say by paraduma? Vitaval b'mayim. You have to take this hyssop branch, dip it into the mixture, and sprinkle it. So it has to be enough to dip from the beginning. Hachanami, haktiv, if you remember by the chatat sin offering, what does it say? Vitaval b'dam. The Kohen's supposed to dip his finger into the blood. The itmar, and it was said, Amar Rabbi Zreika, Amar Rabbi Elazar, af b'dam lo kidesh. Also in the blood, it doesn't work if you don't have enough. And now comes Rav and brings a braita. This you might remember. Amaravatanya nami hachi. It's a braita that proves that you have to have enough blood, and this is going to prove that you have to have the shear of the blood. Vitaval. Okay, if you remember, this is the pasuk. Okay, I'm going to read it. Vayikra chapter 4, verse 6. Vitaval l'kohen et etzba'o badam. He dips his finger in the blood. V'hizat min adam, and then he sprinkles from the blood sheva pamim l'fnei Hashem, 7 times before God. Okay, this is in the Kohen HaMashiach. Okay, but it doesn't matter which korban it is. The point is, it talks about dipping in the blood. So, taval v'lo mesapeg. You have to dip the finger in the blood. The Kohen, he can't go around the rim and kind of take blood from the sides. Bidam, this is our halacha. Shiehei badam shior tefila mi'ikaro. It has to have enough blood from the beginning when you collected it in that first vessel. That's our halacha. Okay, so here's your braita to prove what we just said. But we're going to go on because we're already here, and then we're going to learn this whole sugya again. Min adam shebahinyan. Well, what does it mean when it says v'hizan, he sprinkles from the blood? What else is he going to sprinkle? We're talking about blood. So that teaches you from the blood that's in this issue. Okay, we have no idea what that means. In a minute we'll get there. Before we get there, we have to explain the first two drashot. Why do you need both these two drashot? If it says you dip your finger into the blood, you might have thought as long as when the dipping goes on, there's enough in the bowl. It doesn't have to happen at the stage of collecting the blood. Maybe it would be enough as long as now you combine those two bowls. But therefore, to teach you, no, the dam has to be there from the beginning. There has to be enough, which was our halacha. Now, bidam means there has to be enough blood in the cup from the beginning. But that's not talking about when you actually dip your finger. Maybe when you dip your finger, maybe you don't have to actually dip your finger. Maybe you could just put your finger around the sides of the bowl and take it from the sides. Therefore, katav rachmana v'taval. Now, the bidam is relating to stage 1 of collecting it, and v'taval is relating to stage 2 of taking the blood out. And that's why you need them both. Okay, now we have to explain this min adam shebinyan. Okay, and that's how we're going to end our sugya today with this topic. So minadam shebinyam lemiute. What is that coming to exclude? Amarava lemute shiraim sheba etzba. When you sprinkle the blood those 7 times, or the 4, whatever you do, the blood placements, in the times of the chatat, when you do use your finger, you sprinkle the blood, you go to one corner, or you go, you sprinkle it 7 times by the parochet, whatever you do. You do it once, and then you dip your finger again. But you can't use what's remaining on your finger, okay? You can't sprinkle with the remainder, whatever it's still, because we all know if you dip your finger, put blood, and sprinkle it, you're going to end up with remainder on your finger. You can't use that. That's what it means. Min adam, the dam shebinyan, meaning the blood that's in the vessel, and you can't use what's remaining on your finger. This supports Rabbi Elazar, who also said, Da'amar shiraim shebe'etzba psulim. Okay, what's left on your finger is disqualified. Amalei Ravim barav adal Rava. Amrei tamidach, Amar Rav Amram. Your student said, in the name of Rav Amram, Tanya, he brought this braita, hayam mazeh. Okay, you might remember blood. If you remember blood, when you sprinkle it, and if in the process, in between the time that you put in the vessel and the time you finish your sprinklings, or we're going to see exactly what, and it gets on your clothes, it needs kibus. We had a whole chapter about kibus and shtifa and barika and all that in Zvachim. Your clothes need to be laundered in the azara because they have sanctified blood on them. So here it says, if you were sprinkling and some stuff spritzed from the sprinkling, from your finger, im ad shelo hiza, if you haven't finished the sprinklings, ta'un kibus. Misha hiza, once you sprinkle, ein ta'un kibus. Once you're done with the sprinkling, if it gets on your clothes, you don't need kibus anymore because you're finished with the mitzvah. Now, the way they understand this is, my lav, ad shelo gamar hazato, umisha gamar hazato, meaning until you finish all your sprinklings, and once you finish all your sprinklings. Now, shma minan, shiraim shebe'etzba, kshirin. What if you did one sprinkling, and then on your way back to dip your finger again, it gets on your clothes? Sounds like you haven't finished all your sprinklings yet. That blood is going to cause you to do kibus on your clothes. But if we just said it's not kosher for sprinkling, then it shouldn't cause a problem of kibus, of laundering. So they say, no, that's not how you read it. It's exactly fits with this. Ad shelo yatztam yado haza'atum kibus. If it hasn't yet left your finger, and then gets on your clothes. But once you're on your way back to dip your finger again and it gets on your clothes, that's what it means. Misha gamar hazato. When you finish that one sprinkle, right? Each one. Misha yatzaz amiyado ento kibus. Once you finish the sprinkle, each one, and you're on your way back and it gets on your clothes, you don't have to do kibus. So that fits perfectly. Another difficulty. Eitiv abaye. Gamar milazo. Now we're talking about the paraduma. We're going to assume it's true. Same thing. Now there, we're not talking about the waters, but Gamar milhazot. Now here, you sprinkle the blood also 7 times toward the Oel Moed, because remember, you're standing on Har HaZeitim there. Now you finished sprinkling. Mekanech yado b'gufo shel para. You take your hand, which had some blood on it, and you wipe it on the para, because you're supposed to burn the paraduma, and with all its blood. It says so in the Torah. So you get any extra blood you have, and you put it on the para. Now, that sounds like when you're finished all 7 sprinklings. Gamar in lo, gamar lo. It sounds like you don't have to wipe your hand in between. If the shiraim are disqualified, you have to wipe your hand in between, right? Your finger. So Amarle, no. Gamar mekanech yado. When you finish the whole process, you do your whole hand. Lo gamar mekanech etzbo. But in between each sprinkle, you wipe your finger off because your finger has got the blood on it, okay? And that's the one you're using for the sprinkling. So they each seem to have 2 different purposes. So now we're going to try to figure out. Now Rashi explains this very differently than he explained it in Zvachim. I'm going to go with Rashi here. Even though he explains it differently in Zvachim, we understood this differently last time. But Rashi here explains, what does this mean? Because it quotes this pasuk v'sarafet haparah le'inav. Rashi assumes, and Tosfot jumps on him and says this didn't happen in 2 different places, but Rashi assumes the sprinkling happened, you were standing in one place, and burning happened somewhere else. So he says, I understand, at the end you're done, you go over to where the parah is going to be burned, which is not where you were standing when you sprinkled the blood, and then you wipe your hand on the animal so that the blood gets burned. But if you didn't finish, right, and you're in between the sprinklings and you're standing here, again, I don't know the distance that Rashi thought there was, but you're standing in one place and the parah is somewhere else, you're going to do one sprinkle, walk over the parah, clean your hand off on the parah. Do the second sprinkle, right, go back. Doesn't make sense to be going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Okay? To which Abai says, Amar Abai, no. You don't do it on the parah, even though it has to be burnt with the parah. What do you do? Bisfat mizrach kidichtiv forei zahav v'gomer. By the way, there's a whole bunch of things in parentheses here because there's a big debate, like I said, about what exactly this question is. We're going with Rashi and without that girsa. It says you wipe your finger on the sides of this bowl, and that's why it's called forei zahav, because from lashon kapara is to atone, but it's also to clean, right? That's what atonement is. It's cleaning. So it's the bowl was meant for cleaning, meaning you clean your finger off in the bowl, and then you're going to take whatever's in that bowl and you're going to burn it with the parah at the end. Okay, so then it's just one walk over at the end, and that works. Okay, this was all an aside we got off on about the blood and how you deal with the blood of the, and how we treat the blood of the shirayim, and how the shirayim, that was just some drasha that we got on a side tangent about. So what we did really were two things today. We talked first about how it works with the vessel, if you can redo it according to Beteira and according to these two Tanaim, only if you haven't yet put it in the vessel, but in the end you're putting in this other sanctified vessel. And we had two explanations. From there we got off on Rabbi Yochanan, who said, why didn't we just say putting on the floor? And from there we got off on a whole tangent about, does it have to be held by the Kohen or not? We saw either all of them have to be, yes, Yavimi, or Rav Sheshet. And kind of Rabbi Yochanan said, none of them have to be held by the Kohen, and proof from, and they basically said, it doesn't say anywhere you need to be held by the Kohen. And we're going to learn it also from the bizichei levona of the showbread that were moved without anyone picking up the table. And then Rav, who had this in-between position, the kometz specifically had to be put into a bowl that the Kohen was holding, and that we all learned from blood. And from there we got into the blood and all the unique halachot of the blood. And that's where we ended with those three drashot, b'taval, b'dam, and min adam, and that got us off on the whole discussion about the shirayim. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a shavua tov and an almost chodesh tov also.